Week 6, remote learning, Cold War, China. So we've been talking about what's going on in the Soviet Union and what has been happening with the fall of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. So now we're going to switch gears and go over and talk about China a little bit at the end of this Cold War unit. Woo! All right, so remember the domino theory that we talked about when we talked about Vietnam? The idea was that if China and all of these other countries started falling to communism, then they would become enemies of the West and that they would join up with the Soviet Union and it would be hard to get goods, like trade goods, and to have an influence that Western nations like the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany had worked for during the 1800s. So this wasn't something that people wanted. So, well, like in the West, the United States and China actually ended up healing their relationship when the Chinese decided that they were no longer friends with the Soviet Union based on philosophical differences with communism. So, although China was communist, they had their own issues and they had their own visions for what communism was, and they ended up breaking diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, even though all these other Southeast Asian nations, such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all fell to communism. So, one thing that happened in China during this time period was this really extremist group was born in China. It was called Great Leap Forward. And they wanted collectivization of farms just like they had in the Soviet Union. They wanted communes. They wanted peasants to work the land um, together, and they wanted no incentive for their work. So it was like the state just profits off of their labor. So the government makes all the money off of all the food that is cultivated by the people who are working in the fields, and it was like a huge leap backward toward time period where we had essentially like serfdom. So I know that in eighth grade you're supposed to talk about serfdom, which is where we have these manors and then there's these nobles, and the serfs are essentially slaves that are tied to the land and receive nothing in compensation for their labors. And that's essentially what was going on during this Great Leap Forward moment in communist China. So it's kind of ironic that they're called Great Leap Forward when it's very backward. So the crop failures of this time, so there weren't enough people cultivating a variety of different crops. And what happened was there was these widespread crop failures that killed 20 million people because there wasn't enough food. So one thing that we learned during the agricultural revolution in the early 1800s is that crop diversity is essential. You also need to do crop rotation in order for your fields to maintain their health. So, what happens is if you're growing the same food in the same field every single year or every season for multiple seasons, so for 4 growing cycles, you grow the same exact thing, what happens is the nutrients get drained from the soil and it causes crop failure. And that's essentially what Great Leap Forward did, is they drained the fields. They were utilizing, again, that slave labor principle, and it just was bad for everybody. In 1966, there was this teenage militia group that came about. And again, this is just another extremist organization, the Red Guards, and they are Chinese people who are calling to essentially beat and kill anyone who resists communism. So Mao Zedong, the leader of China, the communist leader, he was trying to put down any social or cultural revolutions. And Mao Zedong is now known for the number of people that he killed. So it's so many people during this time of communist China. People who were speaking against the government got killed by groups like the Red Guards or just by the Chinese government. So this Cultural Revolution in 1966 is not what you would think of as a cultural revolution. It's not like revolutionary in the sense that it's new and democratic. What they were trying to do is they were trying to put down any resistance to communism. Their revolution was to uphold the principles of communism, of this idea of equality, and to make people conform to communism and to kind of keep that indoctrination of, communism is good, it's the Chinese way, it's culturally who we are. And that's why they referred to it as a cultural revolution. So, getting these young people on board with what it meant to be in communist China. So in 1976, Mao dies, and their new leader named Deng Xiaoping, he is kind of in support of modernization. Now, he's not going all out, but he does want some private businesses and a bit of westernization. And as this happens, the standard of living increases. So people's incomes increase. They allowed more American music, appliances, hotels, which comes with tourism and opening up cultural centers for tourist purposes. And what happens is it opens the floodgates for young people to want democracy. So by 1989, with all of these people coming in and out, and ideas and music, and all of this free media and things like that, it starts this uprising. And China's leaders are like, hey, we're still communist. Yeah, we let you have some Western things, but perhaps it was too much. So 100,000 students occupy Tiananmen Square, which is this huge public space in Beijing, right outside some other museums and government buildings, and they start this ginormous protest for democracy. And they're basically arguing that if we're going to allow tourism and music and free enterprise, then what is the difference between those things and us being entirely democratic? Like, let us have a voice. You're giving us a taste, and we want the whole thing. So it ends up, obviously, we remember this event as being very tragic because governments do not want to lose control over their people. So the people in charge are not democratic. They're not into democracy. So if there were to be a shift, then these people are risking losing power. And China would, start a ginormous change. So one thing that's really well known from this time period is this idea of the tank man. And you're going to be watching a short video on Tank Man. So as the tanks are pouring into Tiananmen Square, where all these young people are protesting, this one man, he's got, helmet, he's got a bag there. He jumps out and he stands in front of the tank. And you might think, oh my goodness, that tank's just going to run over him. But that's not what happened. The tank dodges him. And it's just this symbol that people, just one individual, can make a huge change, can stop an onslaught of military personnel and weaponry from entering a certain location. That this one person's courage can change the path of what is intended, and that humanity and human nature steps up, that like the person driving the tank dodged him. So it was the idea that people can make a change. So you're going to watch a video about this. So I'm not going to spoil it. Watch the video. So what ends up happening is it's that the troops, so 100,000 troops to match the 100,000 soldiers are sent to Beijing. And not everybody stays. There's about 5,000 people. They start a hunger protest, and they create this paper mache statue. It lasts for 4 days of this goddess of democracy. And then eventually the tanks do smash through the barricades. They ruin this statue, and gunfire is sprayed into the crowds, killing hundreds of unarmed young people, and it wounds thousands of people. And it's just a violent symbol that democracy was not going to work in China during this time, that the hope of these people and the changes that had happened perhaps were going to be squashed because there was the idea was that the people had too much freedom. So countries of the Western world, like Great Britain, France, the United States, put embargoes on Chinese goods, which means a refusal to trade. So well, we're not going to give money to a country that is going to kill people who are seeking democracy. China arrests protesters, Democratic sympathizers. They expel hundreds of journalists, and they start doing that strict control of the press. So, all, like I said, those westernization moves that had been made during the late 1970s are getting rolled back. So, it's halting liberalization and it's deteriorating the trust between China and the West. That censorship, the control, all of those things are getting rolled out in this new era where a lot of countries that had been communist are receiving freedom. China in 1989 is losing lots of freedoms because of these protests. So, thinking about China today, in the last 30 years, what has happened? Well, obviously, we still do a lot of business with China nowadays. We can't rely on any nation to produce as many goods as we can rely on China. And because of that, our relationship is vastly complex. So we need the goods from China. They need our business. We need their money. They need our money. And we continue to trade with them. However, we know that their information, the flow of information in and out of China, is not as clear as it is with other countries. So, we don't really fully know what's going on in China in all remote parts of China. But we do know that in Hong Kong, in the last year, in 2019, 2020, there have been widespread protests for democracy, and there has been a lot of violent government resistance. This image here on this slide is from a protest from February of 2020. And they have sent armed guards, but democracy is rising again throughout this time period of uncertainty. Everyone wants answers from the government and clarity as to what's going on. So China is still communist. There are still pushes for democracy. We continue to work with China for products, and it is one of the few remaining communist countries on the face of the earth. All right, I guess that about wraps up communist China. So have a great week, and next week we're moving on to something different. Bye.